So before getting started with this video, I want to apologize for... There was a bit of delay with this one because I was doing some upgrades and changes to my setup, so I had pushed the... I had pushed the Kong video out before this one, which still kind of worked with the relevance of time, but I still wanted to make this video because I thought it was pretty interesting. So when I made my Shogun review, I made a brief jab, very brief one-line jab at the Last Samurai about it being a white savior story, as it was considered, and a lot of people were upset about that quite a bit, and I mean, not that much, but I found that pretty interesting because I thought that it was kind of, at this point, just generally believed as such. It seemed that there was quite a big defense for it now, which, and I thought, I haven't seen the film in over 10 years. At the time, I was probably too deep in my cynical historian phase to appreciate the film for what it was. And yeah, that's pretty much the case. Quite surprised at how much I enjoyed my review of this, my reviewing. And this video is more so focused on a particular issue, the topic that I had brought before. Is The Last Samurai problematic, or is it a white savior story? And I feel like there's a couple ways we can look at this, but first we must consider what is a white savior story, because there seems to be some confusion on that. On the surface, a white savior narrative is a tale where a white character involves himself in a setting with non-white characters and proceeds to save them from whatever situation is going on. Now, people will argue that Tom Cruise is not a white savior because he doesn't save anyone. He actually does a couple times, but that's not as important. Technically, no, he's not. He is an observer. He's a vessel, kind of like Blackthorn is supposed to be in Shogun. For us, the Western audience, to witness this not as well known moment in Japanese history. Now that's where things get kind of hazy, because although it is based on the Satsuma Rebellion, it's kind of its own thing, really. Again, a white savior narrative will place a white character in a non-white setting, more often than not one that they see as uncivilized, and at least initially, and then partake in the white man's burden. In case you don't know what that is, the white man's burden was actually it's a pretty relevant theme in this movie.
Japan's got it in mind to become a civilized country.
It's a case where white people felt that they needed to bring civilization to, territories that they didn't have control over. It's essentially a fancy excuse for colonization. And part of why this discussion has reemerged is because of Shogun, where people had been placing similar arguments, mainly on the trailers because they didn't know what the story was about. I kind of think that both of these stories help each other out. Both of these properties have white leads who serve as viewing vessels for Western audiences to peer into significant moments. And a major difference being that with Shogun, William Adams was actually someone pretty involved that the story parallels, whereas Last Samurai... I love when people try to counter-argue that Algron is based off real people, or a real person. They go off of one. Really, he's based off of two people, both of which are not super involved in this story. They serve as inspiration, but Algron still is essentially his own character. Now, I'm sure that many of us are familiar with what's going on with the Meiji Restoration, being that, at least in America, this is one of the few things of Japanese history they actually teach you. And we know that they're going through these major reforms, both to modernize their government, modernize the tech, and there's just these concerns with losing the culture involved, which brings in, the imperialists versus the shogunate, both of which were interested in modernization. It's a big misconception, but they wanted the power in different means. That was a big thing. And that brings in our main hero of the day, Saigo Takamori.
Saigo Takamori?
The Bakamatsu and the Boshin War, just it's very interesting, and it's just rich with interesting historical figures. It's not the main point of this. We just need to know that Japan is going through this major political overhaul and cultural overhaul. And Saigo Takamori is an interesting figure. He was one of the most vocal against the shogunate, and he is entirely loyal to the emperor. He was one of the leaders in the Boshin War. He actually led the imperial army through the Battle of Toba Fushimi, which was one of the most decisive battles of the Boshin War. He was a major, crucial role in removing powers from the daimyo and returning them to the emperor. And this essentially replaced the feudal system with a now more centralized government. And he also played a major role in bringing about the conscript army, which was, samurai were pretty tricky back then. To be a soldier typically was by clan or family. There were cases, though, where, famous peasants became lords. But now with the conscript army, many more would be mandated by the government to enlist in the army. And this was a pretty universal practice back then. Now, I think because of this movie, there's a misconception that Saigo was against progress, which isn't inherently true. He wanted the focus of modernization to be on the armies. He was against ideas like the railway network, but he wanted to beef up the military. And again, his primary concern was to the emperor, not so much to modernization, and he still had heavy concerns with the culture. And things got heavy when Korea insulted the emperor by not acknowledging him as a proper power. Saigo wanted to go to war with Korea over that, so much that he was willing to be a martyr for it to open. And the government wasn't really big on this idea. They thought that it wasn't very smart economically, and because when they sent people out to study the Western worlds, they kind of felt a little belittled. But Saigo was against the business interest of the government. Again, everything was about pride and pride for the emperor. And this would kind of lead into the Satsuma Rebellion. So when he goes back home to Kagoshima, he starts the Shigako, which were private military training academies, which was his thing. He started that. Built up these big forces in Satsuma, who had succeeded from the Meiji government, and that's where the movie kicks into place. I'd also like to take this time to clear some things with the Tom Cruise character, alright? First, he's based off of two people, as I said before. The first is Eugene Collage. I'm really going to be putting those 2 years of French I took in college to good work here. He fought for the shogun during the Boshin War. Keep in mind that both of these people were French officers. The film in general kind of just stays focused with America's involvement. I guess they thought it'd be too busy if they threw the rest of Europe in there as well. He was involved quite a bit in the Boshin War, but ultimately he was caught and imprisoned, and he was pardoned and sent to France, where he was court-martialed because he did abandon his post to fight with the samurai. That's really all there is for him. The other was Jules Brunet. His career is definitely more interesting. He had a pretty respected military career, having fought in the French invasion of Mexico. Afterwards, he moved to Japan as a military advisor, kind of seeing a little bit more similarities with this one. After the war was over, the French were ordered home. Brunet, however, stayed back and was quite loyal to the shogun and helped in the Boshin War. He was a part of a different rebellion, entirely different rebellion, and you could kind of combine these together and make this overall idea of just the spirit of the rebellion. You can kind of combine these characters together because Brunet also had an ally who you could attribute to Katsumoto. He was involved with the Republic of Ezo, and that was another separatist state that fought against the Meiji, and that was actually quite a few years before this film takes place. He was sent back to France afterwards, and even the Meiji wanted him to be punished for his involvement, but it was later revoked because his buddy, that I mentioned before, and he was pardoned. You could compare Cruise and Watanabe more with Brunet and Enomoto Takaaki. instead of Saigo, but then it's kind of something different. So, inspiration, sure, but it's still not quite the same level of parallel, really. Algron really just kind of is his own person. Now let's talk about the film. I love the opening juxtaposition with the noble warrior Ken Watanabe who dreams of a white tiger, to the drunken American hero. And of course, the core of the film are these two. They're both these warriors that have been, they're going against the demands of their nation and have since been abandoned. Of course, the major change here is from France to America. In terms of Americanizing, they did pretty well. Instead of the fighting in Mexico, it's now the slaughter of the Native Americans. And it almost feels like a jab at certain historical films as well, and an obvious jab at the white man's burden, and the overall brutality of America's treatment over the Native Americans that they tried to justify it by means like this, with American heroes fighting off savages, also as promotion. Rather revolting. So, our white lead here, Tom Cruise, is already shown to have more of a conscience, and he's mortified that he did not, in fact, get to dance with the wolves, but now is being asked to dance with the Japanese, employed by Colonel Bagley, who is kind of your typical bad guy, probably gets off on killing people, and Amora, who is a politician with evident business interests. Algron, in his drunk and depressed stupor, says, what the hell, I'll go. Oh yeah, this is still the Katie Holmes phase, isn't it? Bagley and Algron are connected to a real event, the Washita River Massacre, resulting in thousands of dead peaceful natives. Men, women, and children. So it's pretty reasonable that someone with a conscience, like Tom Cruise's character, would be in the state that he is. And I know that this movie came out in 2003, and maybe because the end of the film era, there's such a 90s feel to the cinematography, which is really glorious at times, and then probably looked better in standard definition. The set pieces in this film are incredible, and the filming in New Zealand was a smart choice, even though it was quite a busy place at the time for filming. I've had Japanese viewers tell me that they believe that New Zealand was a more faithful portrayal of Japan of the time, and even for me as a non-Japanese viewer, it's definitely more convincing than other ventures. The Emperor's Conference was actually filmed at the rather popular Soundstage 19 in Warner Bros. Studios, where interestingly enough, Sayonara with Marlon Brando was filmed. I really enjoy the body language of the three here. You can tell a lot about their characters. You can see Algron respectively trying to learn against Bagley, who obviously is quite opposite. And now we start to learn about Katsumoto, the actual lead of the film, who is not super like Saigo, maybe on the surface, but they did romanticize it quite a bit. But again, they're not exactly calling him Saigo, it's still kind of its own thing, even though his story does parallel real history quite a bit. One of the big things was the going back to bows and arrows. I'm calling bullshit on that, alright? This is a film device here trying to really exemplify this idea of going back to tradition where, guns have been in Japanese armory for since 1548, technically. There was a brief time where they were banned. Well, I think it was just specifically the imports were banned because they started making their own. It's weird, and I don't fully agree with it, and I know a lot of other historians don't agree with that either. Another concern is also the armor, which is very also Sengoku era and not very Meiji. Again, we're trying to build up this romanticized traditional image of samurai, I suppose. It's not very reflective of the time period. As for the fighting itself, though, I've watched a couple different videos of swordsmen watching and explaining this, and it seems pretty well responded. I mean, there's different schools to fighting, so there's different styles and whatnot, but it seems like in general the action is approved in this film, except for some obvious Tom Cruise moments. And by the power of being badass, Cruz survives and earns the respect and curiosity of Katsumoto. And this is where the tropes of white savior start to weave. Katsumoto patches Algron up, and he sobers over a brutal time. And then there's a winter where he's trapped with Katsumoto, who promises to let him leave when the winter's cleared. And throughout that winter, Algren's soul is saved by the Japanese ways and manages to learn most of the language and culture within a winter. Many, even fans of this film, have pointed this out as being unrealistic, but I do have to say that they did make a point of Algren having a pretty good knack for picking up language, him being a linguist. So, I mean, I don't know. I studied Japanese for a couple of years academically. I think that he got the optimal learning experience, really. So I don't find it that overly unbelievable compared to other concerns that I have with this. But what Algren does gain in this winter is what stands above other white savior tropes, I think, and what puts this film above those. You know, Algren doesn't believe in the white man's burden, nor does he assimilate after some heroic notions. He reluctantly begins to see how the traditional lifestyle is good compared to the horrors he's witnessed in modernization. It's pretty simplistic and rather poetic in execution. There are a few moments where Algren gets to be a hero and moments where he has to sit and watch events that he cannot control. He does have some saves, and I mean, hell, he prolonged the life of certain characters that were brought to the ultimate conclusion of his suggestion. And this is where it gets kind of weird. The rebellion isn't really shown so much as it was. There were quite a bit of battles fought, and we don't really get that. We get, we have the prison escape and a ninja attack, because most of this movie is focused on Algren as he's viewing Katsumoto's group. So the focus isn't too much on the actual war aspect. It's, like I said, it's a bit more simplistic but poetic. It should be noted, though, that some people have made complaints about some of the battle ideologies in this film. Psycho retreated. He retreated in real life. That is something he did. He was overwhelmed. The conscript army surprisingly held their own. There's this whole crazy thing. And he had to flee. He did. And it kind of pushed him to the end. And I never found that this film was inherently preaching tradition is better than modernity, but rather to look at the consequences and to try and find more of a balance. And I feel that Saigo initially felt like that before he felt that the government screwed him over. Again, this film is greatly romanticized, but I don't think it's too damning. But there are some lingering issues. The entire ending feels Hollywood. I hate to say it. It feels Hollywood, and it felt like it was more concerned with meeting those tropes than ending the movie that it started. And also the whole final conflict being influenced by Tom Cruise's suggestion, mind you, rather than just the imperialists continually beating and hunting Saigo down until the end. Saigo rejected surrender and fought to the end of his own accord. The film does show this, and many have complimented the film's presentation of Bushido. As I said, my biggest concern or issue is with the ending. Spoilers, that is that Tom Cruise gets to live. Yeah, I know, I hear it, I hear the whining, yeah, I know. And, all the scenes that happen afterwards, as poetic as they may be, it feels contradictory a bit to the themes of the story. It just feels Hollywood. And I wish that it could have just gone for a more brutal ending. But it's still a damn good movie, so don't take that too much at heart. And of course, the people that did inspire Algren did get to live, and although they were not involved with the fabricated events of this film, they went to fight in other wars. In this one, Cruise stays and gets a Japanese family now. The scene with the Emperor is really good, though, and it almost redeems the whole thing. The Emperor Meiji was quite young at the time, around 25-ish, and interestingly has the same birthday as me. So at this age, he was doing all these major reforms and reconstructing the country. Here I am around that age, talking about a movie about him. Yeah, and this movie does well to illustrate how there are these opposing forces trying to influence the young emperor's thought. But in the end, Katsumoto's sacrifice reigns supreme, and I feel like that could have still been established without Algron. But people really like this line.
I will tell you how he lived.
And it's not a bad scene by any means. It's actually a rather good one. It's just I'm indifferent about the ending as a whole. All in all, I would say no. This film is not problematic. If you want to see a problematic movie, go watch John Wayne's Barbarian and the Geisha. And now I just offended the very small amount of people that have seen that movie, and now I owe that one a video. That one's not getting a video. And I'm not gonna pretend to be the biggest Tom Cruise fan. He is a popular name that can reel in audiences, especially at this time. And it helps bring attention to this story. While not being entirely accurate, and only really having a few real irksome moments, it still shows Western audiences a rather beautiful story that hopefully would encourage them to research the real history. I think it's a brilliant made film that actually rather opposes the white savior trope. It still holds the image of a non-native person and a new culture, almost immediately mastering it. That is a bit of an issue. The film uses the excuse of his background as a soldier, and I feel that could have been handled just a bit better, just to kind of counter those concerns that people would have. Like I did when I first saw the film. And Ken Watanabe is incredible as well, and he also stands to say that this is not a problematic film. Sonata probably feels different, considering what he said in that interview about Shogun. He probably actually feels like his character does in this movie. Watanabe, I think, is a great actor. I think he's phenomenal, in fact, who unfortunately I don't think gets enough good roles to match his ability. Admittedly, I have not seen Tokyo Vice, although I've heard quite good things about it. I might check that one out if I don't know if there's enough demand for it. And I really feel that this movie wanted to respect Japanese history, even while still taking its creative liberties. I don't recall the film ever, preaching to be super accurate or authentic. Granted, this movie is over 20 years old now. Oh my god. If you haven't seen it, but have been turned off by the idea of Cruise being in the film or concerns of it being a white savior narrative, and if I helped that, I apologize, and I would even say give this movie a shot. There are definitely far more concerning takes on those tropes to worry about that can just be flat out ignorant or disrespectful, and it feels like they really tried with this one. Do not be disrespectful. And they have a very large cast of Japanese actors actually playing Japanese roles. You may be thinking, well duh, but back then actually it wasn't that common. If I were to rate the film, say, I don't know, like a letterbox system, I'd probably give it a solid 4 out of 5. It's a damn well made film with a lot of care put into it, and it may not be ideal for history nerds, but I think the broader audience can see past that and really appreciate the film for what it did. And it's also just shot so damn beautifully. I mean, this shot, oh, and this is coming from someone who spent the last 10 years thinking it was nothing more than drivel. Sometimes a rewatch can really make a difference. That's all I really have to say about this. I hope that I've cleared up any concerns or issues that people had with my previous remarks. I'm sure I'm still going to get comments. And if you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It really helps my channel out a lot. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. And I will see you all next time.